Okay. The third thing, so we need to know God's story. We need to know our story. The third thing is we need to embrace God's version of our story. Right? So if you take this, if you took God's story, here it is, and you took your story. So they're both stories. They're both real things that are happening. The third thing to cooperate with God is we have to take God's story and lay it over top of our story. Because our story in and of itself is not enough to understand what we're supposed to do. We have to take our story and let God's story come in over top of it. Why? So we're not stuck in what happened, and so we're able to embrace God's redemption. So in every story, no matter what difficulties you've faced, no matter what trauma you've had in your life, God will take everything that happens in your life and He will redeem it for something good. And I know for those of you who have experienced severe trauma, I know that's sometimes very hard to believe. How is God specifically going to use abuse in my life? You say, why would this have happened? You're a young child, and out of nowhere, your mother dies. You lose your parents. I have a friend who, when he was young, they were in an accident, and in the accident, both of his parents were killed. In an instant, he loses his parents. That's a painful, traumatic thing. He might live his life, if he didn't overlap God's story onto his story, he might live his life constantly, never having the answer, why did this happen, right? But when we put God's story of what He's doing, redeeming things, you think about people in the Bible whose lives were redeemed, people in the Bible who had things that God took that were meant for evil. Joseph, right? Joseph was sold by his brothers as a slave. Sometimes when I say that, I feel what that must have been like. His brothers took him and sold him. He was gone. He was never going to see his family again. Sold into slavery. If Joseph just lived, think about this, if Joseph just lived with his story and he didn't have God's story on top of it, when his brothers showed up, if Joseph is just living his story, when his brothers showed up, Joseph is going to have a lot of fun with his brothers, not in a good way, because he's going to get them back for what they did to him. But because he had overlaid God's story on his story, Joseph in that moment was able to say, God, what you meant for evil, God meant for good. Why? Because Joseph was able to see that God wanted to save his whole family and the people that were coming after them. He knew the promise. And so because God redeemed his life, there was this saving of the whole nation of Israel. That's just one picture. David's life was redeemed. Rahab, her life was redeemed. Peter's life was redeemed. Paul's life was redeemed. Pulled out. Now, let me just give you one more example. So here's Paul. He spent all of his life becoming a Pharisee, becoming a rule abider, becoming someone who knew what God had said and understood the scriptures. And then God redeems, because then he became Pharisaical. He started killing the Christians. He started putting them in jail. And then God takes that and he says, you know what? You have a lot of knowledge. I'm gonna redeem that out of your life. And Paul becomes one who writes most of the New Testament. So, why do we need to know God's story and to embrace God's story? Because we put it on top and it makes us able to see the flow of the story and move towards God's trajectory. Romans 8:28. And we know that God causes all things to work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to His purpose. I want to say to you today, if you are living with pain in from your past, or you are living with questions from your current, you're living with difficulties, I want to say to you today that God will take everything and He will work it for good. And God, here's an example. Many times when people suffer any of those things that I said, even losing your parents at a young age, God, if you will let God's story overlap your story, you will become a person who is uniquely able to minister to people who have experienced the same thing. That's just one way that God takes our life and gives us purpose through His story overlapping our story. Number 4.